All right. Well, welcome to the Interfaith Council of Greater Sacramento, our evening of generous listening. And tonight's topic is faith and addiction. And I'm going to introduce our panelists and then we will let them each begin the conversation about faith and addiction. And then the conversation will be amongst us, if you will, and then we'll invite questions as it goes. Our panelists include Jason Steckel, who currently works at, and I don't have it in front of me, but in a recovery mostly working with young people in a recovery program for young people, and has a background also working in congregations. Ken Capps is a journalist by trade, both TV and also print, has been involved in both, but mostly television and some radio too, if I remember correctly. And Ken has been involved in 12-step programs, and he'll tell you some of his journey and connection. And Ellen Spencer, adjunct professor at William Jessup University, clinical director for the Custody to Community Transitional Reentry Program, a community-based program for female offenders, and has a long history as a therapist and clinician dealing with folks with various addictions. With those sort of brief, and I'm Scott Sorensen, a Lutheran pastor, and so dealt with this issue with parishioners, and also former program director at that same Custody to Community Transition Reentry Program. With that, I'm just going to start randomly and let Jason start off and tell us a little bit about kind of how he approaches this whole topic about faith and addiction.
All right. Hey, thanks, Scott. Yeah, I'll give you a bit of an introduction, a little bit of my background, just to kind of tell you where everything's coming from. So as Scott mentioned, I currently work as a prevention specialist with Recovery Resources. It's a mental health agency in Cleveland, Ohio. In that particular role, the bulk of my work, I spend time with primarily middle schoolers and high schoolers, providing evidence-based education around the idea of substance use, mental health, all kinds of other stuff, communications, decision-making, and all kinds of other things that tie into that. So that's currently what I do. I've been in that role for about 2 years. In terms of some of my other background, I spent almost 14 years as a full-time paid youth and family minister, working a lot with youth, encountered a lot of addiction issues there, both with students, with young adults, and also with parents. And then some other work I've done, I worked for a while with CASA. If you're not familiar with that, it's Court Appointed Special Advocate. So worked with foster youth, specifically with older foster youth, helping them with planning for aging out of the system. And I've also worked as a case manager, where I've obviously encountered addiction in a lot of different forms, working with our clients there at the mental health agency I was with. Educationally, I have a bachelor's degree in management, which has nothing to do with addiction directly, but also have a bachelor's in Bible and ministry, a master's in missional leadership from Rochester University in Michigan. And I have completed 1 year of an MSW program here at a school in Ohio. So kind of got some educational and professional experience, both in the faith and in the mental health addiction communities. And that's kind of really shaped how I've approached addiction and faith. I also, just for fun, like to read about things like trauma and addiction. I mean, those are like my light entertaining readings. You can think whatever you want about me, because that's what I choose for my entertaining reading. But I do enjoy those kind of topics, have dealt with addiction in my own family and in my extended family and friends outside of my professional endeavors. So to me, these two issues, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it, but there's definitely, for me, a lot of overlap. I think the way that we approach our faith can have a lot to do with how we approach addiction. And I think we'll have some time. I don't know how much you want me to get into now, how much you want me to wait on. But for me, one of the key issues that I think overlaps a lot between both addiction and faith is the idea of comparing guilt and shame, and the difference between those two. I've done a lot of reading of the work of Brene Brown, a name that may or may not be familiar to you. If it's not, somebody I would highly recommend at least spending some time with. And she really digs into some of this. It's not her, she's not kind of the one that came up with all of it, but she does a really good job of making it accessible. And this idea that, to make it super simple, shame is the idea that there's something wrong with you, that you're bad, and that guilt is that you are making poor decisions or bad decisions. And I think that for me, whether you're talking about faith or whether you're talking about addiction, that difference is so incredibly important. I've been a part of a number of different faith communities. I have been a part of some that do shame really well as a way of trying to bring about behavior modification. In my personal opinion, that's a really awful way to bring about behavior modification. And it's a little bit, in my opinion, of probably not the best theological approach to that idea. And I would also say that's true in the addiction realm, where if we are shaming people who are struggling with addiction, that's not productive. That's not helpful. My faith informs, in a sense, one of the things that is really central and key to me is my faith, and my understanding of my faith is that every human being is created inherently good. And then we just have things happen. There's the work of Dr. Bruce Perry. One of the things Dr. Perry says is, don't ask what's wrong with you, ask what happened to you. And my experience has been, in my own personal experience, I've never personally met somebody struggling with addiction issues who doesn't have some underlying thing that has happened to them, whether it's a biological issue or a life issue or a mixture of the two, that has caused or feeds that behavior. And to me, all of that all fits together in terms of how we attempt to help those who are struggling with addiction. And I've unfortunately been a part of and seen faith communities where shame is the primary driver. And often when I see folks in addiction, that kind of approach often drives them deeper into the addiction and does not really lead them down the path of healing. So I think that's really crucially important. So I could probably go on and on and on, and I'm sure we'll have some dialogue along the way, but that's kind of some underlying framework of how I come to this topic in terms of how I look at faith, how I look at addiction, and how I look at the way those two work together as we're trying to find healing. And if we're going to be really honest, at some level or another, almost all of us have some type of addiction. If you don't believe me, look, there's probably like a little electronic device sitting somewhere close to you that at times you find yourself picking up without thinking about it. So obviously not as severe or significant as some other forms of addiction, but if we're honest, all of us probably to some extent deal with some level of addiction with something in our lives, or at least at some points along the way. So I think the idea of grace, compassion, and looking at guilt versus shame are kind of some of the underlying things that are important to me as I try to consider this topic.
Thank you, Jason. I'll toss it over to Ken. Give us a little more introduction and kind of, Ken, your initial kind of thoughts on faith and addiction.
Thanks, Scott. My name is Ken, and I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is August 31st of 2014, and I'm very grateful for that. It's only by God's grace. And August 31st, 2014 was also my 54th birthday. And so I spent my 54th birthday in the back of a state trooper's car, arrested on a DWI, and went to jail. And I knew I was an alcoholic, but I didn't want to admit it, like most alcoholics. And 2014 was a very rough year for me. I had suffered a traumatic brain injury. I had to medically retire from this great job I had. And I really lost myself because my job, I had let my identity become my job. So when I lost my job, I lost me. And I already had a drinking problem, but then you tack on the great pain pills I got for my brain injury, and I was just circling the drain. And so, you know, I had all the bad things happen to me that alcoholics have. You know, I had lost my job. I was locked out of my house. I couldn't see my kids. I had no place to go. And I was ready to die. And fortunately, you know, you can either go to, I have found from my experience from working with jail inmates now, you can choose to go one or two ways. You know, you can either choose to seek recovery, or you can choose to die. And I have seen it both ways in the Alcoholics Anonymous group that I'm in Dallas, as well with people I work with. I've had people that I've worked with that have killed themselves because they just didn't want to follow the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so anyway, I went to rehab, got into AA, and you know, what I found early on was, you know, you can't do AA without God. It's all over the big book, which is what we call the book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And you know, you can go through the first 144 pages of the book, which we always tell new members to do, and it's all about a higher power, which, you know, can be, which I call God. And so as time has gone on in my almost 8 years of sobriety, I have tried to give back, which is a lot like the Bible, and start working with prison inmates. And here's what I've learned. You know, it's really a lot like the Bible. I mean, it's God's will, not mine. I must surrender my will to God. I can't absolutely not get sober without God's help. And right there in step 2 of the 12 steps, it says, I came to believe a power greater than myself could restore us to sanity. And like I talk to the inmates all the time, hey, if we could have gotten sober or kicked our drug habits by ourselves, we'd have done it a long time ago, but we couldn't. So God offered me also forgiveness for my past sins. And you know, we talk a lot about, and this is what I practice every day. I get down on my knees in prayer every morning, and thank God for another day of life, and ask him for another day of sobriety. And at night, I talk to him about thanking him for another day of sobriety, and to get me through the evening, because it is one day at a time. That's a big thing in AA. And so I'll just wrap up on this, because I know there'll be discussion on it. But so when I talk to these inmates, you know, they want the same thing that non-alcoholics and non-drug addicts want. They want forgiveness for their past sins. They want unconditional love, and they want, you know, peace and serenity in their lives, rather than the drama and trauma that they've gone through for many, many years. But when you bring up God, all of a sudden there's this whoa, because kind of like Jason said, many of them have had a lot of bad experiences with God in their prior lives. And either their parents have used God against them, like Jason said, in either guilt or shame, or I've had guys that I've talked to that have been abused by a priest or another religious leader, or they think that because they've asked God to forgive they've asked God for something and God hasn't given it to them, that God doesn't like them. And I'm just putting it in the simplest of terms. So it's a big challenge getting to these guys sometimes about that God is that God is on their side. So we'll talk a lot more about that as we get on. So thanks for letting me share that.
Thank you, Ken. Dave, I'll catch you up here. Jason has kind of introduced himself, as has Ken, and now it's Ellen is going to introduce herself a little more.
Okay. First of all, Ken, thank you. I appreciate so much when someone honors us with their story, and that is in fact what you do. And what I think as I kind of thought about what do I want to share tonight, and I've got to be honest, I wish I was better prepared, but I want to sort of take you through some of the discussions that I've been in today. So I came into the mental health field via international business and international trade. So I've learned from an early stage in my career to look at a lot of different perspectives and to really think about a lot of alternative ways of thinking of things. I do teach and have taught at a Christian university, and that has been both a blessing and a challenge sometimes because it becomes a little bit about stretching our perspectives. In my current role, I work 20 hours a week for Kaiser Permanente doing psychological evaluations. I'm working on my PhD right now in neuropsych, and I work as a clinical supervisor for a treatment facility for reentry population where I met Scott several years ago. We have about 95% of our female inmates who have come to us with either an active addiction, including on the inside, because the reality is you can get and find and trade whatever you want on the inside. Them have developed an addiction while they were at the institution, sadly, even if they didn't come with one. For me, a lot of this perspective has been about really trying to work with the guilt and shame that Jason brought out. For a lot of folks, guilt gives us an opportunity. If we go back to the Garden of Eden, when God says, "Where are you?" It's not because he has no idea where they are, because he knows exactly what they've done and exactly where they are and what leaves they're wearing. What he's really saying is, come to me so that we can resolve this issue together. And I think so often when we look at how the church with a capital C has interacted with a lot of people when it comes to addiction, there's a lot of blame and a lot of this is a you problem. When we really look at addiction, so often there's all these other underpinnings. There's trauma, there's past hurts, there's absent parents and parentified kids. And so as I sat in a research meeting today at Kaiser, we were talking about the challenge. Someone had brought a research article out of Singapore about how to integrate religion and how it was helpful and restorative and productive, but also how it was harmful sometimes when people were going through some kind of psychological recovery. And it started a large discussion for us about why does religion make people so uncomfortable? And why so often we are unwilling or unable to integrate faith as part of the healing process. But so often psychology is built around all of these models of healing in community. And the reality is what is broken in community, whether it's a family or a friend of the family or a peer group, often has to be restored in community. So I take my Jesus into everything I do. I think it's amazing that I work in a CDCR facility, and in the middle of a trauma class, I show the ladies the shack. And I tell them, I don't want you to get bogged down in the theology of it. Believe, don't believe. But let's look at some real world examples here of some of the psych work that you're learning through your text materials. And I think so often when people sit down to study the Bible, it can be really intimidating. And so they don't really know how to approach it. We can bring a unique perspective of being able to help them get a real world view of what does grace and forgiveness look like? And a lot of times they have to embrace forgiveness of themselves and have no idea how. So I think the other part, again, what Jason was mentioning about shame, guilt points me to a corrective action. Shame damages my identity, and shame makes me want to turn away from. And yet, as we just heard Ken articulate beautifully, the whole pathway to healing is all about doing away with secrets and lies, standing in the truth of it, acknowledging who I am today and where I've been, but also acknowledging that's not my identity, that's my story. So I think those are some of the pieces and perspectives that I bring, and it makes me sad that so often as a profession, psychologists do not do a better job of allowing people to have a belief in the room that may make some psychologists uncomfortable. And that's something I think is a growth area.
Thank you, Ellen. My name is Dave Katz, and I want to apologize to everyone on the call. I had trouble getting on the internet at home, and just as we were talking about all the eloquent things that were just said, I have to own that I was late on the Zoom, so I apologize. And I'm really glad to see that that this discussion isn't dependent on any one person, and that that spirit is streaming on its own through those that are here. So I'm not going to interrupt the flow of that spirit, but if we want to, everyone's had a chance, I think, to make an initial statement. Is that right, Scott?
I didn't have an initial statement, so I'll round it out.
Please go ahead.
Again, for the other folks here, I'm Scott Sorensen. I am a Lutheran pastor by trade for 38 years. And so how I approach this topic of faith and addiction as one who both professionally and personally have friends. We all have connected with addictions as various voices, Jason pointed out. But my oversimplified piece is that there are kind of two categories. On the one hand, those who aren't active in recovery, if you will, have no idea how hard it is to be in recovery. Those who, I can cognitively think about how difficult it is to be in recovery, but I can't say the dreaded phrase, I know how you feel, because I have no idea of how difficult that is, because it's only those who are standing there who know what it is. And too often, I think, Ellen, you touched on this about how the healing community sometimes isn't very healing by not recognizing, faith and other pieces. And I think too often, the faith traditions that I come from do want to tell people, well, why don't you just try harder? Or why don't you, and Ken, you're like, well, if you could do it on your own, you would have done it a long time ago. There's just this sense that folks are afraid of it. And so some very daring recovering alcoholics in my life have really taught me a great deal. One brief story from my time with the women at the correctional transition facility. They were, they honored me with their stories and how they would say, the insidious thing about these addictions, and one who was literally doing time for murdering her infant child because she would shoot up and get high and then breastfeed her infant, and her infant died because of overdose. And she taught, there's somebody who had some issues to deal with, but you're going, and she goes, if a sane person doesn't do that, if you could stop doing that, you would do that. You wouldn't kill your own child that way. So there's a lot to learn and a lot of grace and forgiveness and understanding and just standing with folks and not laying shame on them when they already have a whole heap of that. I think the role of the faith community is not to be blaming and shaming, but can you use the word forgiveness? That I think we've got to start there to help people, all of us, kind of come to grips with what we know we don't know. Because I'll tell you, and Ellen and Ken both can, and Jason, I think all might agree to this. If we had nobody who was an addict of any kind, we wouldn't have many people in prison. If we could get rid of that, it would reduce, and then the trauma that goes with it, because the trauma that goes with it. But so there's a whole lot of this intersection of faith and addiction, and I'm kind of on the sidelines compared to my colleagues here. But it's one that we approach, I think, with care, because we're dealing with injured people.
Well, Scott, I just wanted to add on to what everybody said, and that I think it's important, and because I talked about how when I start talking to inmates about God, that automatically brings up religion, and then they get all hypersensitive about that for whatever reason from their past. And what I try to talk to them about is, this is not a religious program. This is a spiritual program. This is forming a new relationship with their God. So this isn't necessarily reading scripture out of the Bible, although it can be, but it's forming a one-on-one personal relationship with God. And I tell you, I learned that myself. I mean, I learned that I didn't have the relationship with God that I wanted. And in AA, I've learned, I mean, me and God have a great relationship. I could not be happier with my relationship with God. Unfortunately, it took going through a living hell and a daily recovery to do that. But once you start talking to these guys about a spiritual recovery, it kind of softens them on God a little bit. But one other thing that our esteemed panelists said, guilt and shame, there's two other things that really get to these guys, and it's anger and fear. Okay, those are the other two big issues with them, because everything comes down with these guys to either anger and fear. Something has been taken away from them, or something is they can't get something that they want. And so that's why a lot of them are in jail, like you're saying. If it wasn't for addictions, nobody would be stealing, nobody would be doing murdering, nobody would be doing a lot of different things. But it all boils down to many, many times in these addictions to anger and fear, and they act, and when you pour alcohol and drugs on top of it, it just makes it even worse.
Thank you, Ken. I would like to throw a question out, partly from my experience of working in a community clinic where we had a drug treatment program, and a lot of our patients were either in the program or actively using outside the program, but we still had to treat them. We never turned anybody away. And I wonder if our panelists could say something about faith and the certitude that everyone's an equal human being. Because I think that division between the users and the non-users, I've seen as very counterproductive. And someone said to me once, I can't remember who it was, that there are only two types of people who are in recovery and people who haven't started recovery yet, because of all the various addictions that there are. And some addictions are more easily hidden than others. So I wonder if our panelists could talk about the unity of humankind and the faith that's behind that as it affects those who are using and those who are in recovery. Anyone?
Yeah, I'll be glad to take my shot at this one. So, I mean, to me, it's all grounded in Genesis, in the creation narrative / poem / however you deal with that text. But it talks about, you know, all human beings are created in the image of God, and we all are made from the same thing. And I think to your point, and also I think Ken made this point, but you know, you kind of really succinctly, you know, we're all either in recovery or haven't started yet. You know, we're all, I mean, if you look in the book of Romans, Paul talks about all have fallen short. And so we're all in the same boat. We're just in different parts of the boat. Some of us don't even realize we're on the boat. So we're all in different places, and we're all in need of forgiveness. I don't see anywhere, from my Christian perspective, I don't see anywhere where there's anybody that doesn't need forgiveness. And it's actually interesting that we're kind of spending some time on this forgiveness piece. So this week, I have a little devotional book I work through for the year. And this week focuses on the Lord's Prayer. And I had this kind of little phrase that popped into my head yesterday morning, that forgiveness is an ecology, not an economy. And I think we have tried, a lot of churches have turned forgiveness into something that you have to earn instead of something that you already have and you just have to find it and let it grow. And going back to even talking about, you know, the shame piece, if you have to earn something from God, you're always trying to earn your worth and your value. And but if you are inherently good, created in the image of the divine, then it's an ecology. You're trying to grow in your understanding of forgiveness. You're trying to realize it and find it. You already have it. You know, one of the analogies I have used is that all of us are buried under some kind of rubble, whether that's experience, things that have happened to us, whatever you call it. And that rubble is a lot of times what leads people to addiction, because they've got all this rubble on top of them. And addiction often is just a way to try to numb the pain of all the rubble that's on top. And when you have to earn your way out of that rubble, I don't know anybody in the planet that could be buried under a pile of rubble and could lift the rocks off themselves and get out. But if you fundamentally realize you are good, then it's about allowing God to help you and the community to help you remove the rubble so that you can find your true self, that's underneath all of the rubble of the pain and the fear and things that Ken talked about. So instead of, you know, if there's shame and if there's more of that, and people, you know, again, this goes back to your initial question, you know, if we realize that we are inherently created good, as the book of Genesis says, then all we're trying to do is find healing to return back to that state. And it's a journey for all of us. It's not like we were born a mess and imperfect, and we have to spend the rest of our lives trying to earn our way to value. We are inherently born with value. The journey of recovery is to rediscover that reality, that we are created essentially good. And that's how faith, one of the key ways faith informs how I deal with addiction and talking to people that are struggling with addiction.
Well, and see, this is just the opposite of the way most prisoners feel about themselves. They think they're inherently bad, and they've been told that by their parents, by their peers, by their preachers. And so let me give you a great example of this. The topic, I choose the topic every week with these guys, and then I share a story from my past and then let them talk. And, you know, that was one of the big surprises when I started doing this ministry, is I thought they would all sit there like this and not talk. And, you know, and of course, you know, I always tell them at the very beginning, you know, what's said in this room stays in this room. But, you know, I thought they're not going to talk, because when they go back out into the pods, you know, they're going to say, hey, you're not going to believe what Jason said in there. And then somebody's going to get their butt kicked. You know, I'm just being honest. But these guys really, really opened their hearts. And so the topic was forgiveness. we're going around the room, and this guy says, I don't think that God will ever forgive me for all of the terrible, terrible things I've done in my life. And I mean, you could have heard a pin drop in this. It was a Zoom call then because during COVID. You could have heard a pin drop. It was dead silence. And I could feel the hair coming up on the back of my neck. And for a second there, I was kind of stunned as to what I was going to say. And I mean, I'm just glad it came to me. And I said, sir, and everybody else in this room, if you don't leave here today remembering anything, let me please remember this. You have already been forgiven by God, by his grace, for all of your past sins. So you don't have to worry about that anymore. Just take that off your plate. Okay? God has forgiven you for all of your sins. And I think that's what's interesting is that people in the past have used these inmates' sins against them, you know, to make them feel even worse about themselves. And so, and they don't understand, like Jason is saying, they think, well, I have to earn this forgiveness somehow. And these people are pounding in it that I can't be forgiven. And so once they hear the good news that by God's grace, they've already been forgiven, this is like a new reality for them. And I try to bring this up every once in a while because, you know, guys do rotate through and there's new guys and everything. But I think that's just something so important to bring up to these people all the time, because there is so much, they've just been called bad people most of their whole lives. And they've just got to get a new reality about themselves.
And I think my profession, David, respond to your question about everyone an equal human. My chosen profession is leads the pack at helping people not feel equal. Yeah, we clergy do a really fine job of, you know, doing the exact opposite of what some of our sacred texts in various religions will talk about. But there's one where, you know, I pray that I'm not like so-and-so over there, you know, thank God I'm not like so-and-so. And we do that, and preachers unwittingly do that because we don't know how to deal with our own shame. And so I'm not as bad as so-and-so, you know, and so I think when we're dealing with addiction, it's, well, my addiction isn't as bad as theirs. So, you know, and I saw this with the female inmates too. They did that to themselves. Well, you know, my crime wasn't the same as theirs. You know, I'm of a different caliber of that. Instead of, you know, Jason, your point that the Latin Imago Dei, we were created in an image of God, which is really important, but also important that we also have our own issues to deal with, but God is still going to work with us no matter what. And Ken, your point, there isn't anything that's going to stop God and for whatever, again, that higher power, however you understand God. I'm looking at some of the names of here. Everyone's God, their God is going to love them. You know, there is peace there, but I'll lump us preachers as doing a poor job of laying out that theological truth that people need to know that everyone is equal. And our culture doesn't do a good job either. I mean, the news is full of, you know, what about so-and-so, and trying to, you know, the caste system that we create. And Ellen, you probably have something to say about those sort of things.
So it's interesting. I'm laughing as you're saying the case system, because I think we do artificially, inherent in religion, want to create a sort of, okay, but that's a 1.5 on the sin chart, but you know, that's a 10. Wow, that's really bad. And I think a lot of times we talk about forgiveness, but the hardest person often for us to forgive is ourselves. And when we receive so much judgment from so many sources, and then you want me to forgive myself. And what I hear a lot is, but if you only knew what I had done, if you only understood, you wouldn't say that about me. And I think we have a remarkable opportunity to take a largely unchurched group, a church that has probably marginalized them, has definitely hurt them, has probably beat them upside the head with the Bible more than we've opened it for them. And what I like to do is tell them stories. And I'll tell them stories of people they can relate to. And I'll say, do you know who is in Jesus's lineage? Let's go back through that story. Let's look at who I think his great grandma was. Let's look at Rahab, or let's sit and look at a couple of brothers who were so jealous that they sold their other brother into slavery and then lied to their dad about it. But then let's look at what God does with that life. And all of a sudden, these stories that they may know a snippet of become real. And that's where we can say, and you know what? God didn't pick the shiny, pretty, happy people for us. He picked people like you and me. He picked people in the mire. He picked people who screwed up. I mean, imagine thinking, yeah, I denied Jesus 3 times that night. That's kind of a really big deal when he's your best bud. And all of a sudden, they become able to relate in so many ways to this. And now they begin to see, I'm worthy of forgiveness. And this is where we can start to bring in some of the psychological underpinnings and say, if you own this as your identity, your crime, the things that happened to you, the substance use, the things you did while you were high and not sober, then you begin to tarnish who you are. But we look at an innocent child in the womb. That child comes in with everything on board, pre-packed. So when you make judgments about yourself, you're taking God's place of judgment instead, and you're recreating who you are, and that's not okay. And I'll say, all right, so if I sat in front of you and told you the same story, would you not forgive me? Well, no, we like you. They call me Miss E. We like you, Miss E. And so, no, we would never do that. Okay, but what's different between you and me? And so sometimes we have to take ourselves out of the story in order to be able to embrace forgiveness. And that externalizing process, often done through storytelling or through having them substitute a best friend or even a child. Would you judge that child the same way? Sometimes that allows them to embrace some of those pieces.
Thank you, Ellen. I don't want to be the only one asking questions. Does anyone have a question for anyone else on the panel? Well, we've looked at what is an obstacle to faith for the person who's contemplating recovery or in recovery, but what about the people around them? How can the clergy and the family members and the other people in society that come in contact with people who have been addicted or are currently addicted not separate from them? Because I think as several people, Scott and Ellen, were saying, that the reaction that the people around a person who's a user or former user has to them just reinforces the internal messages that they're already giving themselves. The internal messages are incorrect, but so too are the societal and the messages coming from family and clergy and teachers and so on. How can we heal that side of the equation so that a person who's trying to be in recovery can meet the other people eye to eye, face to face, and not from a hierarchical difference in position in society?
Well, we have a saying in AA that when you get out of recovery, there's normally no brass bands at the airport when you get home. People are still very skeptical of you. You've got a lot of they're tired of hearing you say that you're sorry. They don't trust you yet because you've left a lot of damage in their lives. I certainly did, in my family's life, in your friends' lives. But on the other hand, the big book also says you're supposed to treat a recovering alcoholic or drug addict as somebody that just got out of a hospital, and treat them with that same compassion as a sick person who's trying to recover and get healthy. The problem is most people don't do that. And I sure didn't get that support from my family at all. And that's why at my AA group in Dallas, every meeting is totally full because there is, as we've talked about here, a sense of community. There's a sense of trust in that room. There's a sense of no judgment in that room. And, I tell you, even today at 8 months, almost 8 years sober, I mean, I never jinx myself. It's one day at a time. But, people are sick and tired, and I'm still sick and tired of being judged on what I did prior to August 31st, 2014. I really am. I've made amends for those things. I do living amends today. But there are some people that are just not going to get over those things. And, but that's not on me, that's on them. And when you get in that room at AA, people are not holding resentments. People are not judging you. You can speak openly, you can speak freely, and you get that sense of community that sometimes your family or your friends withhold from you. And I think that's so important in post-recovery because, here's what's always happens, and I'll close, this is so important. All of a sudden you'll see somebody missing and people go, because people go to meetings every day. I go to meetings every day when I'm home, every day. I mean, I don't need to go to meetings. I want to go to meetings. It's part of my medicine for the day. But you see somebody gone and it's the same story every day. Every time they come back, what did they not do? They quit going. First of all, like I said, they quit going to meetings. They quit praying. Okay. They quit talking to their sponsor. They quit reading the big book. They got out of their routine of sobriety, of doing what they do in sobriety. And it's all about, it all goes back to God. It all goes back to God, talking to God, being around people that believe in God and are willing to forgive them all the time. And, we welcome people back, with open arms. A lot of times people go back if they relapse, and, not many people, I mean, I knock on wood because, I'm always looking over my shoulder, that, I'm one drink away from a relapse. Okay. Every day. But we encourage people, please, if you go out and relapse, please come back. Because if you don't come back, there's a pretty good chance you're going to die. And this happens all the time, David. And so I hope people that are out there understand that, most alcoholics are trying their damnedest to stay sober, but it's very, very difficult, as Scott said, and we need help in a community. And if we don't find that community at home or amongst our friends, we definitely find it in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Thanks, Ken.
I'd like to piggyback on what you said that popped a couple things in my head, Ken, as you were talking. One of the things I've experienced, I have friends who are in recovery. I have, as part of my master's program, I've visited a couple of AA meetings and have some friends that are part of AA. It's been interesting to me that I feel like I've seen a lot more Christ-like behavior in AA meetings than I have in church buildings, or at least in the basements of churches that I have in the sanctuaries. And it takes me back to when Jesus says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And I'm pretty convinced, and I don't speak in absolutes, but I'm relatively convinced that most of the people that pass judgment on somebody, such as somebody in recovery or a recovering alcoholic, the issue is not the person they are judging, it is their own undealt with issues. And I try to tell people that because I've personally had not the best experiences sometimes with churches, and I have friends that have not had those kind of experiences. And it's that remembering for me, and this is trying to go back to answering your question, David, I think if the faith community was going to do one thing to be better at helping those in recovery, it would be to go to what James says in James 1, to look in the mirror, or you can go to Matthew 7 when Jesus talked about the speck in your own eye. I mean, pick your passage. I could probably quote 4 or 5 verses. Like, people ask me all the time, and I'll clean this up since I don't know what my language barriers are here, but I have people ask me all the time, like, if there was one phrase you wish you could tell people, what is it? I say, own your stuff. Don't always use the word stuff, but that is first and foremost, whether that's somebody that is actively in recovery, kind of going back to your point earlier, people that either are in recovery or the ones that don't realize yet that they're not in recovery, it's owning your stuff. And I would argue that many people in the faith community that have a judgmental attitude, they're really projecting their own undealt with stuff onto the person who they're judging. And that might be kind of harsh, but that's just the reality that I've experienced and witnessed.
Thanks, Jason.
But as David, you asked the question, I think my own uncomfortableness in relating, especially with somebody new in recovery, is, well, what if I do the wrong thing? It's that what Jason was, I'm worrying about me and not on them. And the message that I've learned over the years is simply, I will not abandon you. My word is simple. I won't give up on you. You might give up on yourself, but I won't give up on you. So I think that's and that's who's what Jason is saying too. But there will be this hierarchy feeling of folks unless you really model accompaniment. You need to model, we're going to walk side by side here, and I'm not going to abandon you, and I'm not going to begin to understand your pain or minimize it, but I'm also not going to run away either. And I think those of us with family and friends who are in recovery or not yet in recovery need to practice that. I will not abandon you.
Thanks, Scott. Ellen?
I think it goes to that place of, we are called to be compassionate. And so much in our world today, there is no compassion, there is only judgment. And it's really interesting when we meet people where they are at, it's compassionate to hold them accountable. It's compassionate to expect things of them. So often, a lot of times people with addictions feel like, well, I've messed up so much, who cares? Oh, I always do this. It's never works out. That good things are for other people. And one of the things that I've found is I call people on, as Jason says, their stuff. And as I call them on their stuff, what I'm then following up with is, I see you. I see you in front of me. I see the human being. I see beyond the life you've lived, beyond the addiction. I see Christ in you, even if you don't see it. And I think that's that idea of being a loving community where we come alongside, because let's face it, we're asking people to believe in the goodness of community, and they don't see it very often. If we can't model it, if we can't walk beside them in love, how can we expect them to understand what love is going to look like? Real love, not codependent love, not judgmental love. And frankly, for a lot of us, we begin to know the 3-part God through our earthly relationships. Our Heavenly Father is often a reflection of our Father relationship. And so if someone has come out of a place of a really painful process or really painful relationship, they're going to need a lot of assistance to really get there is a loving, compassionate God there, because they're looking at it going, yeah, my dad wasn't like that at all. My dad was performance-based or judgmental or harsh. So I think that's a big piece of it. And the other thing is, and we talked about this word sobriety a bit tonight, I think we really have to continue to focus on sobriety, because I may make a choice that is leading me towards sobriety, even if it means that it isn't inherent in and of itself a good choice or a super sober choice. So if I'm an addict, I break up with my boo, I come home, I eat a carton of Haagen-Dazs. Not really a great choice, but compared to using, a very sober choice. And I think sometimes when we can help them to begin to reframe what does sobriety look like, they get a richer understanding, and some of that self-judgment falls away, and there's some space for compassion and forgiveness of self.
Well, you're not going to get pulled over and thrown in jail for eating a gallon of ice cream either. So there's that. But there's the other thing is that's why I think, and Scott, you talked about this earlier, is that when people that are not in recovery tell people in recovery, well, why don't you just stop? Just stop. Just get over it. And that's why it's really difficult for people who are not in the program to speak to others in the program. And what I have found in my service work is that alcoholics relate to other alcoholics, because we've all been through the same pain. It may be different scenarios, but we've all been through the same scenarios one way or the other. And we're willing to trust each other and be open to each other, that we're not maybe willing to be open and honest with each other outside of those rooms. And so when I go, and I 12-step people too, I've gone and spoke to many people who have, they've had their family call me or somebody and say, hey, can you come talk to my husband about, getting sober? And I always say, well, I'll come talk to him, but there's only one person that can choose to get sober, and that's him. Not me, not you, him. But at least when I go talk to that person and they will admit that they have a problem, they at least listen to me, because when I start telling my story of a living hell, they can relate to it because they're going through the same thing right now. And I said, look, it just kind of goes back to the whole God thing too. I said, look, recovery and maybe going to rehab and getting into AA, this will be your ticket out of hell. You do not have to live like this anymore. And like the whole panelist said, people, not only do they think they're inherently bad and they can't get better, but they also think they're stuck in this situation and they can't get out of it. But the truth is they can. And when they have somebody that they think that they can trust, that they've seen get out of it, like me, occasionally they'll listen.
Well, that brings to mind another question that I have, which is, what is the power in each of us to let the other person know that they have that light and that treasure within them that they should take care of? They've received these messages through their life up to this point that the only way they can feel worthwhile is to do some kind of substance, because their own internal environment is so full of the blame and self-blame and guilt and negative messages So what is it, for instance, Ken, when you go out, you get a call and you go out, what is it about you that reveals that in the other person?
Well,
them?
you know what? Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. And I just tell them my story. I just be as open and honest and tell them my story. And trust me, if we had, a whole hour, I could sit here and Scott, I've known Scott for 30 years. Scott married me and my wife. Scott baptized my first child. Scott has heard the story of my addictions long before I went to AA and got sober. So I just sit down and just being open and honest and vulnerable. And I'm very open about my sobriety and about my past, and I always tell them, look, you can't change the past. And this is what so many people get hung up to, is the past, the past, the past. And a lot of their families still hangs the past over their head, and it's like, look, you can't change the past. But what I tell them is, what I have learned in my sobriety is I can learn from my past. And now what I'm trying to talk to you about is I was literally about to die. I was considering killing myself because I was in so much pain, and I thought there was no hope for me. And when you lose hope, you've lost everything, in my opinion. And I tell them all the time, look, God that never leaves us, we leave God. I found my God again. I got sober. And so you can do the same thing. You can do the same thing. And I just think just laying it as bare as you can, David, and just as raw as you can. And I mean, it's the truth. I'm not making anything up. This is the real deal right here. And I think that will really shake people up. But then it's just not a one shot deal. You just don't talk to them and walk out of the room. I mean, you really have to, call these people, invite them to meetings, take them to breakfast, take them to lunch. I always carry with me, and I've got one in my bag. I always carry with me an extra blue book, big book to hand out. I've handed out a big book to a flight attendant before who saw me reading my big book, came and talked to me about it. So you never know when you're going to have the opportunity to talk to somebody about this. And but it's just the honesty and the openness and being willing to be vulnerable. Because I always tell these guys too, and they don't quite understand it. I know I'm talking too long, but this is so important. I tell the inmates at the end of our hour, I say, look, I hope I'm helping you stay sober, but this hour, you're helping me stay sober by allowing me to talk to you. And I don't think they quite understand that, but that's a big deal in AA.
So Ken, I want to just give you some feedback. I could have turned my sound off and just watched you. I could tell that you care. You care about that other person that you're with. And when you recount a story of being with them, I can see you're reliving it. I didn't even have to hear the language. I could just see how much you care. And I would just put that out there, that is a huge power. It's a huge power for one person to care about another, because it's not a commonplace thing for most people, whether you have a substance problem or not. It's just not, it doesn't happen in most of your interactions all day long. And it's huge. It's like when you're sweaty and hot and thirsty and it starts to rain, it changes everything. So I wonder if the other panelists would talk about that care and loving and seeing the other person as a human being who's a treasure, a child of God.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ken. Thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate you and the work that you're doing. And I think it's really awesome. Not everybody can walk into a situation. Ken has taken a situation and used it to bless other people. Not all of us necessarily maybe are alcoholics in recovery. So to your question, Dave, I can't walk into that room and have my own story of recovery from alcoholism. So for me, the key is to approach with an attitude of humility and an attitude of hospitality. I try when I've talked to students, not just addiction issues, but all kinds of issues. I've dealt with students who self-harm, students who have been suicidal. I mean, the whole 9 yards. And whatever it is, what I have found is if when I spend an hour with a student, 45, 50 minutes or whatever, if I talk more than 5 minutes, I've talked too much. So for me, it is ask a couple of questions, shut your mouth, let the other person tell their story. Don't listen without judgment. And then after they have told their story, honor them for telling that story. And I think that is so key because for so many people, that's not been their experience, especially with people of faith. It's immediately judgment and you're a sinner and you this and you this and you this and you this and you this, instead of thank you for telling me your story. I am sorry you've been through that. That had to really be painful and difficult. And I honor you for being vulnerable enough to share that story with me. And just that posture makes all the difference in the world. And Ken, obviously, a lot of what he talked about is that posture, but he's able to go in and lead with his own story. Not all of us have that story, but all of us, every single person can approach with that posture of humility and that posture of hospitality to give the other person the space to tell their story, to not judge it, to not comment on it, just to hear it, to thank them for it, and just to let it sit and not feel like you have to immediately tell them what they've done wrong. Trust me, I've dealt with plenty of people in addiction. They don't need anybody telling them the things they've done wrong. They are well aware and they tell themselves that all the time. We don't need to remind them. So listen, honor, love, be hospitable, and let the Spirit do its work in the midst of that. Again, going back to what I said earlier, let forgiveness be that ecology, that thing that we try to foster an environment where forgiveness can grow, not where it has to be earned. So that's kind of, to me, if it's somebody that's not coming from a background like Ken, we still can equally come to the table from a different place and offer just as much of the hospitality and humility and a chance for vulnerability. Just has to look different because we don't walk in with that story to share.
Well, thank you, Jason. I think I'd like to share a personal story that illustrates that at this time. And I did share this on a previous exploring the sacred panel, but I think it fits here and I'm going to take the liberty of sharing it again. I am a retired physician. I was a physician for a long time in Yolo County. And at one point I was called to the hospital for a man who had gotten a infection on his heart valve by using dirty needles to shoot heroin. And so I took care of him and we got him the antibiotics and he went home and didn't show up for a few months at the clinic. And then he was back in the hospital with the same infection from dirty needles again in his heart. And that repeated itself the third time he went in. When I heard he was in and I had to go and see him, my first thought was, oh man, what kind of a, stupid person doing this to himself. And he's making me get up in the middle of the night and I don't like to do that. And so I went in and we got him stabilized. And after a couple days, he was well enough to talk with him. And one thing you have to know is his first name is the same as my first name, David. And for some reason, when I went in on that third hospital day, and I'll never forget it, somehow something clicked that he was David and I was David. And he seemed like me. And there was nothing logical about this. I didn't have any premeditation, but I sat down in a chair instead of standing next to his hospital bed. And I said, David, I see you're a really smart person. And I see that you have a lot to offer people. You've had a lot of experiences in your life that could help a lot of people, and you speak well. But I'm afraid for you because I've had a lot of patients that have been in your situation, and almost all of them are dead. And I'm just afraid that that's going to happen to you. And we talked for a while, not, anything. He didn't say, "Oh, I'll never use again," or I didn't press him. We had that conversation. We talked a little bit. I took care of him for another week in the hospital, then he went home. And I really expected that I'd be seeing him again in a few months, or else finding out he was dead. And actually what happened was I didn't hear about him for about 3 or 4 years. And then one day at the end of a very busy morning in my clinic manager brought in this envelope, and she said, "There's a guy in front of the clinic at the desk, and he says that he brought this birthday card for you." Well, you have to know that my clinic shared a building with the mental health clinic, and it wasn't my birthday. So it made no sense to me at the time. And I said, "Well, I'm really busy. I've got 3 or 4 patients still to go, and just put the card on my desk and tell them I'll read it after I'm done." And so I finished up with my patients, and I went back to my desk, and I opened the card, and the card was, "Dear Dr. Katz, it's my birthday today. Thanks for my life." And he wrote, "I'm now a leader in Narcotics Anonymous group. I've been clean for 3 years, and I'm fully employed as an apartment building manager. So thanks for my life. Signed, David." No phone number, no address. And I'll never forget that. That was the most moving interaction I ever had with another human being who was also a patient. And it really taught me that if you let the other person know that you see a human being, a person like yourself, then that spirit works. It works through you, it works through them. And I kind of get choked up telling that story. I showed the card to my mother, and she hugged me and said, that's why I brought you up to be the way you are. And I actually have it framed, the card. I don't know how to get a hold of him. I don't even have his last name, but I knew who it was, and never could thank him for the card. But I thank him by telling the story, because it really meant, it was a huge lesson for me about the equality of people, and letting people know that they're the same as you and you're the same as them. So thanks for letting me tell the story. Scott or Ellen, did you want to add anything?
No, David, thank you for that. It just, what struck me, and it's that story, I think, is actually more universal, though, isn't it? But it's particular. But I think, as I'm going to ask the medical doctor here, have we narrowed our understanding of what it means to cure? That the capability of curing and healing was not in the medicine, it was in the person of you, right?
Exactly.
And isn't that the case where all of us have tried to outsource cure to somebody else, when we might very well, and Jason, you know the text I'm thinking of now too, are we not sent to be those who bring cure to the sick? And it isn't always needs to be someone with a medical profession to do that. but all of us have been gifted in ways to bring powerful cure to folks. And sometimes that cure is in the recognition and the honoring of the human being in front of us. And that, as my esteemed colleagues have pointed out, we are all capable of that. We're all capable of that. And I think that's, I think, one way where faith and addiction absolutely touch, because irrespective of our faith traditions, all of our faith traditions value the dignity of the human being. And we think we've been endowed that way by however we understand our higher power or creator. So they really appreciate this story, and it just reminds us that curing is for all of us to be in that business.
Well, Scott, hey, I wanted to just, I wanted to make sure I got it right. So I looked it up. I just wanted to read for everybody real quick, the first couple of sentences of chapter 7 of the big book. The title of the chapter is called Working with Others. It says, practical experience shows that nothing so much will ensure immunity from drinking as intense work with other alcoholics. It works when other activities fail. This is our 12th suggestion. Carry this message to other alcoholics. You can help when nobody else can. You can secure their confidence when others fail. Remember, they are very ill. Life will take on new meaning. To watch people recover, to see them help others, to watch loneliness vanish, to see a new fellowship grow up about you, to have a host of friends. This is an experience you must not miss. Wow. I mean, who would want to miss that? That's why I get so fired up about this. You know, I mean, it's just so, I mean, like I said earlier, if I don't do service work, I'm going to drink again. So this is just part of my routine. I have to keep doing to stay alive and stay sober. Without sobriety, I don't have life. That's just the way it goes.
Thanks. Ellen, did you want to say anything?
First, thank you so much for sharing such a precious story, because I think it reminds us all that sometimes what we really need is validation from another human being. And as Jason was saying, I don't have the gift that Ken does to be able to say, I've stood in that same shoes that you're standing in. But I think what people inherently want to know is, do you care? And in that moment, when you sat in the chair and you did some really deliberate things, all of the descriptors fell away, and it was just a brother in Christ in front of you. And that's what people are really asking. Do you care? And can I trust you? Because so often, you know, we look at sobriety and we look at addiction and we want to treat addiction and we want sobriety, but the reality is those are the symptom. The problem is often far deeper and far more painful. And what people really want to know is, if I'm going to trust you with this sacred piece of me, are you going to turn away? Are you going to turn away in shame or disgust or judgment? And will you really be there? And that goes to what Scott was saying earlier about, I will be here no matter what. And I think that so often when we connect with individuals, we may not share the same experience, but we all know pain. And so for me, a lot of times I come in and I look like the church lady, you know, I'm an older person. They think of me as their mom or their grandma, and in I come and I present a certain way, and I begin to unpack my history of domestic violence with them. And all of a sudden the room gets quiet and they understand, oh, you know pain. I can trust you because you know pain. And so I think that there are some really creative ways of just showing up emotionally that allows a safe space for them to be able to unpack. And I love that story because I think that's what you did for that person.
Well, it's not copyrighted, so everybody can use it. Well, we are getting to the end of our panel. We have about 5 minutes, and if anyone has any final comments, we'll end at 8:30 and open the floor for any questions from the audience if you want to put it in the chat.
I just want to say my profound thanks to my friends and colleagues who have agreed to be on the panel, to Ken and Jason and Ellen, and you three are blessings in my life, and now you've been blessings to others. But it's been a real. I want to thank you, and for Jason and Ken, it is late at night, way past your bedtimes back there. I know, on the Eastern time zone. So yeah, he's got his pillow ready to go from his hotel room in Atlanta. So I just want to, my personal thanks to the three of you. It means a lot to me.
Anyone else? Well, I'd like to thank all the panelists and also the behind the scenes board of the Interfaith Council of Greater Sacramento for sponsoring this event. I think that I've come to see our Exploring the Sacred Evenings of Generous Listening as having content and also meta content, because just the fact that we're able to come from all our various life experiences and backgrounds and share important, personal, and powerful spiritual experiences with each other in a very generous and giving way is, I think, a message of its own that is in addition to the content that we've been talking about. And I commend the Interfaith Council for its persistence and courage in continuing our panels every few months. So it might be good to end with an ending prayer, and maybe Scott, would you help us out with the prayer that we can take out into our communities?
Certainly. Let's pray. Holy God, we thank you that you are in our midst, that you will not abandon us, that you have forgiven us, and that you hold us close. Help us in this truth to be your presence for others, to help them recognize the humanity in each person and know that they are loved and cared for. Now provide us all with a gentle night of sleep, that we may awaken tomorrow to a new day of grace. Amen.
Amen. So this session will be available on a link as a recording, if any of you would like to have it. And also I've, in a very sneaky way, taken some screenshots, and I'll forward those to the panel members and to Serene, the president of our board. So if anybody wants them, they can have them. Thank you again, and blessings on each of you.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Be in touch. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Good night.
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 Night.